Hello and welcome to another episode of NBRI New Business and Retail Insights from the Center for Retailing Studies, Mays Business School, Texas A&M University. I'm your host, Venki Shankar, Coleman Chair Professor, Marketing and Director of Research at Center for Retailing Studies. My guest today is Dr. Hema Yoganarasimhan, Professor of Marketing at the Foster School of Business, University of Washington. She holds affiliate appointments in Computer Science and Engineering, Department of Economics, and Center for Statistics and Social Sciences. Hema serves as a co-editor at the Quantitative Marketing and Economics, or QME, and as an associate editor at Marketing Science. Hema's research brings together large-scale marketing data, economic theory, econometric, and machine learning tools to help firms optimize and automate their marketing decisions. Her research focuses on personalized targeting in mobile and online advertising. She also works on methods to personalize search rankings in online platforms in real time. Hema's work also spans estimation of the role of reputation on sellers' and buyers' behavior in online auctions. Combined, her recent body of work presents creative yet technically viable solutions to the challenges that businesses face in today's world. Hema's research has won many prestigious awards, including the MSI Alden G. Clayton Doctoral Dissertation Proposal Award, the Frank M. Bass Outstanding Dissertation Award, and the John D.C. Little Best Paper Award. Hema has been a Marketing Science Institute Young Scholar and has won the Erin Anderson Award given to the Emerging Female Marketing Scholar. Hema has a PhD in marketing from the Yale University. Welcome, Hema, to the show today. How have you been the last 1 year or so managing in this COVID-19 era? Very significant considering that COVID originated in your neck of the wood. So tell us a little bit about how it's all started in Seattle and how you've coped with the last 1 year.
Thank you. Thank you, Venki, first of all, for having me on this show. I'm very excited to talk to you and to, also participate with your audiences. So last year has certainly been interesting, I would say, especially with a 5-year-old at home, with all the schooling challenges which come with that. But in some ways, it's also been good. I've gotten to spend a lot of time with my husband.
So you've been looking at it very positively. You've been very enormously productive too during the last year. So I used the typical description of all your accolades, but I'd like you to describe yourself in your own words, maybe 5 words or less. Who is Hema?
Okay, that's good. So I've been thinking about this, with COVID, we have a lot more time to think, because we don't get to interact with others as much. I think if you think about me, if I think about myself, I think what I do more professionally and so on probably comes a little bit later. I think of myself as mostly like a happy person. I like to spend time with my family. I like to cook. I think then comes research for me, maybe like a fourth. But then I think one of the things I value is to do whatever you do, to do it well. So maybe perfectionism is important. Maybe taking it too far is bad, but little bit of that is, I think, a useful trait.
That's awesome. So you use 5 words perfectly, right? Happiness, cooking, family and research and perfectionism. Yes. And it shows. I guess you're very involved in whatever you do, and the output shows. So let's start a little bit from your research journey. I know that you started with your PhD at Yale. Give me a summary of your research journey the next few minutes so that the listeners and the viewers can get to your background very quickly.
So when I started out at Yale during my PhD days, I spent a lot of time. I was really fascinated by these questions of social influence and social networks and how they affect how consumers think about things and how consumers are influenced by each other and how that affects firms' decisions. And slowly that morphed more into broader questions about digital platforms. And, I started working with, I was working mostly on theoretical models earlier on. Then I started working more with larger data sets. And I would say focusing on a broader set of questions, which happens to many people, I think, as they do more work, they become broader, hopefully not narrower. And now I work these days. I work on everything from market design to policy evaluation. But mostly, I think of my work as having like these two thematic elements, which is applications of like economic frameworks and methods from statistics and computer science and machine learning to understand what we would think are like challenging and large scale marketing problems from the firm's perspective. So not just the methods, but also how does it impact like ROI or revenues for the firms.
So excellent. You started with being interested in social influence, but along the way, as you described, you've become broader, and now you're looking at broader sets of marketing problems. And what is fascinating about your research journey, Hema, is that you have mastered a number of methodologies along the way, right? You said you started as an analytic modeler, then you started becoming more empirical, and within empirical, I know that you do a lot of structural modeling, and then you moved into more machine learning, and you do causal modeling. How hard was it for you to acquire all these skills and still apply them? Most of the people doing research do one or two of these at best. So you seem to have mastered all of them.
Well, I don't know about mastering all of them. I do think, I actually think it's not very hard to learn these skills. I think one thing which is helpful is to start with the problem first and then think about like the methods that would answer them. I think people often tend to think of themselves as having a very narrow methodological expertise and then try to find a problem that fits that. I think going about it a little bit more problem focused. So this is a fascinating problem. Maybe I don't know exactly how to answer it, but then picking up the methods is fun. One other thing which has helped me immensely, which I think you only learn that when you do this, is you actually see very nice connections between different spaces. What you learn in one space suddenly is like applicable in another. So I think when you do that, you are able to see connections better.
See some cross-pollination across domains or marketing problems.
That helps.
Okay.
And marketing is an applied field. We learn, we bring methods from many things. So we are very well positioned to actually kind of blend these things. So I think that helps.
But I like your problem-solving approach, but you make it sound very simple, but that still requires knowledge of all these methodologies and in-depth knowledge of it to be able to apply them to the problem in the correct manner. And knowing that you're a perfectionist, I guess you would go very deep. To go very deep, you should be very facile with all these methodologies. What has been some of the twists and turns? Have there been any twists and turns? I know that you started with the social influence as your fascinating problem, but along the way you also looked at other problems as well. Tell us something more about what are some of the changes that you have had on your journey?
In terms of how I think about things?
Right, things, right.
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I started out, especially as an analytical modeler, so you are often trying to explain things, right? So, okay, why does some equilibrium exist, or why does something exist? And over
you're explaining a phenomenon. You're trying to explain a phenomena, right?
You're trying to explain a phenomena. Why are firms doing this, or why are And one of the things I realized is, as I've worked now more with I'll talk more about it hopefully as we go further. But this question of, I think in marketing, even when we are trying to either substantively understand something, either using analytical methods, or sometimes in causal inference. And I did a lot of that, but I think we have spent less time on how to do things as a field. I think that's how the field started off initially with all the OR people, right?
Exactly.
But I felt like we have moved away from that in that process. that ground that has been taken over maybe by statisticians and computer scientists and other people who have come to fill that gap. But I think marketing in the end for many firms is a question of how to optimize something,
Mhm.
not explaining what they are doing per se. Not that that is bad. Understanding why someone is doing something is important, but at the same time, okay, now that I understand it, how do I optimize it? I think what has shifted in my way of thinking, if anything, I would say, is this appreciation for this question of how as much as a question of why.
Very
Um,
nice. Yeah. And, we used to call this in marketing the descriptive models, which will describe what is happening. Then we will have these causal modeling, why this is happening and how it is. Now, what you're saying, the normative side of modeling, how to do things, right? For a marketing manager, they're interested in, optimally allocating advertising dollars or optimally targeting
mhm.
customers, right? And now you're saying we should be solving more of those problems. Am I
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah, I was saying that it started off that people who came from OR were mostly working on those questions. And I feel like that
Right.
has kind of disappeared a bit. I think both are critical, right? How to do that. And that still needs to be tied to ROI. But it's a very often a very challenging question on how to optimally target, like in real time. And there are
Right.
no good answers. And, just saying that, oh, this type of targeting helps when you control for everything else is not very helpful for the firm. In the end, they have to know how to do it. What are the statistical guarantees of a method like that?
Right.
So both
So,
theoretically and empirically, I think these are challenging problems, which I feel like we have moved away from solving to our
so we should get
detriment.
back to it to rediscover the expanded role of marketing in the real world, according to you. Is that right?
Yes,
Uh,
that
yeah.
would be very
So,
nice summary.
I have the same feeling too. Working with industry practitioner people in our own center, we have a lot of retail member companies, and most of the times managers want to know how to do certain things. They sure want some insights. They want to know why, certain campaign worked, some campaign did not work. Why did a sales promotion work, and so on. But they're not satisfied with that. They want some tool. So that brings us to the concept of, should we be producing not just these normative model or optimization models, but also real tools to help managers, do solve their problems in real time? Should we be spending more time developing those tools also?
That's a good question. I do think there is value, right, in providing anytime if you have an idea or a method, anytime you make it accessible for a larger set of people to be able to use it, the idea has more legs in some
Right.
ways, right? So, like for example, in computer science, we see that anytime people develop something, they develop a framework or a package or something which goes with it, and those kind of things have much more impact in the long run. So I think if we are talking about impact, right, then we
In the
also
real
need,
world, yeah. Then
yeah,
then
we
the
need to
tool
have,
development is very important.
yes. And
Yeah.
it might not be that it's actually, I mean, tools, some of them might not be portable from place to place, but at least the basic frameworks should be broadly portable, right?
Yes, I think I'm glad that you're raising this point. Let's talk a little bit about some of your recent research, particularly, let's start with your research on personalized search and machine learning, which comes to my mind. It's a fascinating paper in which you really show when personalized search can be optimized better with better machine learning algorithms. Tell us little bit about what are the key insights from that research, and what would you recommend to managers?
So that's thank you. So that's actually was one of my first papers where I used machine learning methods,
Right.
and I learned a lot writing that paper myself. So that's a paper which kind of broadly looks at this question of how do you personalize search rankings based on, let's say, both contextual data, broader aggregate data, as well as user
Mhm.
history data. And one of the things it tries to do, which I kind of get into more details in one of my future papers, is this question of what is the value of this behavioral data, like individual level user data? How much can it help you personalize the results. So, knowing what I searched for and clicked for in the future, how much does it help me personalize this value of behavioral tracking? And both in the long term versus as well as in the short run, like, within the same search session, like, versus, in the past. And what I do find is that, yes, there are, there is certainly a lot of value in having these kind of personalized histories. But at the same time, I also find that the real-time queries, the real-time thing, the session level personalization actually doesn't help much, which is kind of interesting because there is a lot of this move towards using active learning methods
Right.
in marketing and more
Right.
broadly. I don't know if it is just that specific context, but it certainly kind of makes us think broadly about this question of what's the value of different types of data, whether
Right.
how, depending on how you slice it across over time, across people, and how you aggregate it and how you store it, and then how they affect some metric of importance for the firm.
So one of the findings that really fascinated me, as you said, is that there's some diminishing returns to using too much of personalized data, particularly, in the short term, there doesn't appear to be a lot of gain. As you said, if you use longer user history data, particularly the behavioral data, then it's useful. But it's got a very important relevance today because you probably are familiar with 2 weeks ago, Google's announcement that they would stop tracking the cross-site usage of shoppers or visitors, and that had created a lot of buzz, right? So what they seem to imply that they would go with their own data and still be able to provide better targeting, right? Or they're trying to acknowledge privacy concerns, right? What is your take on that, if you've been following that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question of like data sharing among firms and like what,
right.
And I've been following this debate, like also because, in another follow-up paper on like targeting and privacy, we looked at this question of like how, what are the implications for privacy? And, GDPR kicked in, and then, there's already limits on who can share data and how long you can store it and so on. So I do, one of the things which I have realized, at least from, my all the work that I have done is on personalization. Now I have, done, at least like 3 or 4 papers on this topic, is that personalization helps, but there is, as you said, pretty strong diminishing returns. If I had 1 week of data on some website, it probably tells me a lot. And, after that, actually the contextual data is pretty valuable, as in people like me who did other things, right? That's as valuable.
So you call it contextual data, and Google called this some kind of a cohort or aggregate level.
Aggregate data, yeah. So not your data per se, but like aggregated data.
People
in
like
some
you,
context.
yeah.
So and one thing the second thing I've noticed is that, as I said, so there's pretty strong diminishing returns. If they're following them on Google, everybody's using Google anyway, and they're seeing a lot of their activity. So the cross website data, the marginal value of that might be really not much. And also even the best personalization models and the very best, with the best of data, often give you only like,
marginal improvements,
2 to 3% improvement in outcomes which matter. Not to say that is not valuable. That is very valuable usually, right? That, on depending on the scale that you are at, that could be big numbers. But it's not that you personalize more, you're going to see a 15% increase in. If sometimes I see papers and both white papers and academic papers with that, that it's
too good to be true, right?
Yeah, it's overfitted in that data. It's not going to work in anything else. So
yeah, I'm glad that you're being very realistic in here. But what I wonder is that Google controls about half of, if not more, of the ad market, at least online, $300 billion or so last year, and Google controls probably 150 billion plus. Plus, 2/3 of those is through mobile, So where do you think this is, going to play out in terms of the consumer privacy per se? Will privacy still be available to the users, or is it just a mirage?
So that's a good question. So actually, in one of my other papers on targeting and privacy, what we actually find and show, in fact, is that platforms, ad networks like Google, have an incentive to preserve user privacy and actually reduce personalization.
Right, I remember that, yeah.
Which is very similar to what you're saying they're doing. Because at the end of the day, when they provide better matching, right? Let's say they provide advertisers like a much more, but then they are narrowing the number of people who are available, advertisers who are kind of participating in that space. So
right.
More, and they're all using auction mechanisms, and all auction mechanisms will lead to a setting scenario where what will happen is that even if this impression as an advertiser to me is valuable for $100, if I'm the only one bidding for it and no one else is bidding, I might get it at a reserve price of $1 or something, right? So actually making it more narrow targeting and having more and more personalization
doesn't produce higher revenues for the platform, right?
Actually reduces the revenues for the platform. And we show that more contextual targeting and less behavioral tracking can help platforms better. And this has been a conjecture that people have had before, and we empirically show it for the case of one platform. So from a platform's perspective, and they are the market makers really here,
right.
they are actually, their incentives are more closely aligned with that of consumers than that of advertisers. Advertisers would, of course, prefer more, more tracking. And what might happen as a result is that these third-party tracking firms, where advertisers are then buying data and cookies,
right.
might emerge, because that's where they might try to actually, if the platform is not doing that, then they might try to get that, but the platform can block that. So.
Right. And plus, they still have to go through the platform for auctions and reaching the consumers, right? They may use the data from the third party
for
cookie provider, but they may still have to go through the auctions and so on. So what you're saying is a very interesting and counterintuitive result, that actually platforms can actually benefit consumers because it is incentive aligned with them. And where do you think this is headed? Because if Google is doing this, and I know there's a lot of tussle now going on between Apple, Facebook, Google in their different views, and Apple also wants to enhance privacy, and whereas Facebook is against it, arguing that it hurts the small and medium businesses who like to target more precisely their users. So where do you think this is likely to head? Is there going to be some equilibrium where all will be well off, or one party is going to win here?
That's a good question. It's hard to predict. My own sense is that people will start relying more on first-party data,
right.
which is I think, especially with the move towards mobile, where when
right.
you are in a mobile app, people can,
you're captive, yeah.
Yeah, you're totally
basically.
Captured, right? Like
right.
your app ID, your user ID in the app is known, and you're fully, it's very easy to stitch together data in mobile services because everybody's phone has an ID.
Right.
And it's using that, it's very easy for them to even stitch that data together. So I feel like as that is happening, first party people will rely more on first party data. And
right.
if anything, the third party data will become less useful, because the marginal value of that when the first party data exists is very low, because you're not going to get, as I said, you're not going to personalize and get 10% returns at some point in some person. And the platforms are being not incentivized to do it, given how things are set up. So my own feeling is that the reliance on, so in some ways, the bigger platforms like Google, Facebook, and so on, which have very good first party data of themselves, will benefit.
They'll thrive. Okay. But ironically, Facebook is the one that is making the argument that it wants to support even finer targeted personalized advertising because it's SMEs,
Yes.
small and medium enterprises, who constitute the bulk of their advertisers. they want more finer targeting.
Yes, advertisers want more targeting in general. So if they're in a two-sided business, right? So they're trying
Right.
to also make sure that
Exactly,
advertisers
because that's where the revenue generation also comes from. But it's very interesting since you have worked extensively in both social influence, and we've talked about advertising mainly, but what about the role of advertising itself with the emergence of influencers rather than social influence, but so the influencer marketing? Do you see some of the dollars shifting towards really cultivating influencers, identifying influencers, growing influencers, and reaching users and prospects through influencers more than direct advertising?
Yeah, there has been a growth in that certainly since, when I, for example, worked on my YouTube paper almost like 10 years back, even
Right.
back then, things like the Ford were like using influencers for video marketing, right? They would give a car to everybody and ask them to use the car and make these videos and post it. Those were like the early days of like influencer marketing. Now, of course, with like Instagram and like YouTube influencers, everybody is really using these people. And I think in some ways, all this personalization and these bubbles have led to an increase in that, because what happens is that when I search for something on YouTube, right, and I watch something, it's very easy for them to match my taste to what I searched for and show me videos from people uh, um, who have like posted. Let's say I watched some cooking video. Now they can get all these like influencers on that and then show me those. So in some ways, the rise of personalization on these platforms has led to an even more, I think, increase in the influencers business. And I don't see that necessarily going away, partly because as most people shift consumption of media to online settings, it's easy to, instead of showing them ads, it's easy to actually show them these kind of influencer marketing campaigns, right? Where there is a third party kind of doing this. I think there used to be a lot of questions on authenticity and whether it's legal. People don't know how much they're getting paid and all that kind of stuff. So I think those questions still remain, but I don't see that going away anywhere anytime soon.
So are you suggesting that marketers should now be looking how to integrate direct advertising, mobile or desktop or any advertising that they're currently doing with influencer marketing in a way that it kinds of feeds each other or synergistic or kind of optimally allocate their dollars across these?
So I think right now they're almost like two parallel things, right?
Right, they're in two parallel worlds, yeah.
Yeah. And I think one of the things which has been challenging, there's been a lot of growth and improvement in understanding how we study and think about the ROI for advertising or promotions, right? Where the firm is controlling the activity. Unfortunately, there hasn't been as much for those influencer marketing campaigns because, you pay this person and they do this, and you are not really measuring directly the ROI of these activities. You don't even know how many times these are shown and exactly, what they are doing. But I think in some ways, that needs to happen first, where we need like better paradigms for measuring the ROI from these things before we can even.
That's not very difficult. So if you have an influencer today, and you can track all the influencers' particular post. If it's an Instagram post versus a TikTok video, you can look at the likes, you can look at the clicks, you can look at the forwards. I think they can still track it, and firms are still doing that. The only issue is that the team that is doing the direct advertising is different from the team that is doing the influencer marketing, and maybe the teams don't talk to each other in the companies. Yeah. So that's what I was trying to think. If there is a way for them to marry the two, then their advertising could be more powerful.
I do think that they kind of join the campaign sometimes. If there is a campaign, there is a promotion, the influencers might talk about that. I think the key question is if these influencers didn't exist, right, from a causal perspective, what would be what would, maybe if there is advertising is still working, the timing is still working. So like experimenting with influencer marketing seems more nascent in some ways compared to like the A/B testing with.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. So I was thinking for the cooking, you could be, a food company like, cereal company or a yogurt company could be actually placing its thing on a recipe with an influencer whom you might be targeted to you, but at the same time, they could be targeting you directly with that particular product. And can they not do an A/B test to see, how that works on you?
I think they can do an A/B test to see whether the ad like holding off, but with the influencers, I if you didn't do because the influencers are kind of like almost like, they make their thing, they post their video, and then the platform ends up showing it. I think that if the platforms, so you need cooperation from a platform like an ad network to be able to also control for that, because there has to be a control group which did not get shown the influencer.
Oh yeah, definitely. They may have to work with the ad network or even the platforms, basically. So
Yes.
if it is YouTube, then you'll have to have a collaboration with YouTube so that those viewers are also served the same
Yes.
YouTube videos of those influencer.
Yeah, except that right now they're not getting a cut of that, right?
Right. I think that there could be some experiment there. So that's a ripe opportunity for future research. So tell us a little bit about what are some of the other exciting projects that you're doing, Hema?
That's good question. So I think that some of the other things that I've been thinking about are questions more recently about experimentation and also potentially personalization in two-sided platforms. Previously, when you think about, for example, serving search results or personalizing ads, there is not really much of a supply constraint. So, whether I see the search result and you see the search result and you click on it, there is no like interference.
Right.
But when you think about things like hotels or airlines and so on, when you think about showing results and when you're running A/B tests, what happens is that when I show some results to someone, and let's say I split the traffic 50-50 and I show a result to someone and this different set of results to another person, what can happen is that when I experiment with half the population, maybe there are 5 rooms and they get filled and it looks like this is a great algorithm. But when I suddenly serve this algorithm to everybody in the world, there are only 5 rooms still. So, the lift is not going to be beyond that. So when you have two-sided markets, both experimentation and personalization can become very challenging, because when you do experimentation, you're doing it on a subset and that won't scale up because of other constraints. So one of the things I've been working with a colleague of mine is to think about this question of how do you think about scaling up experiments when you have these kind of constraints.
Excellent. So, and that must be a very challenging problem. What else, you see are some of the future issues that we as marketers should be working on, which we are not currently working on? You started by saying we should be doing more normative or optimization models. That's right on target. What else is on the future radar that we should be working on, either in terms of methodology or in terms of substantive problems?
So that's a good question. In terms of methodology, I think one thing we are doing less of is what I would say like online systems, like active learning systems, like Bandits and RL and so on. I think they are being increasingly used in the industry now for all these personalization problems. And, we should as a field should be thinking about more about using them. And I think we are starting to, and especially for short-term metrics like customer acquisition, clicks, and so on. But I think there's also this, the industry and also we academics haven't really looked at this long run issue. How does it change customer behavior in the long run? I think, a good thing is like, for example, like this kind of personalization and so on can lead to these kind of consumption bubbles. And we have, heard a lot about how it can lead to polarization and so on. So in the
Right.
short run, yes, it's increasing clicks. That's great. But like there are some big long run changes which are happening in customer behavior. So as a firm, you want to think about like, how that's affecting things. So I think this understanding of online systems and which are optimized on short run outcomes and their performance on long run outcomes is, I think, a very useful, how do you come up with methods to think about that? I think that's useful. I think the second one is, which we kind of touched upon, is, as a society, how should we think about personalization, privacy, and data ownership? There was GDPR, was the last big regulation which happened in this space, but there's still a lot of discussion around these things. And as you said, there is no final answers we have, and I think that's an issue where, the more we can think about what are different incentives for different players and how we can quantify who gets value from what, I think if we have those numbers, we can think more, I would say, it will be easier to think about policy.
Also, do you fear that there may be a situation where too much of these bandits, you mentioned reinforcement learning, short-term optimization, short-term systems, we are automating many of these through these engines, so much so that with consumer behavior or shopper behavior itself could be a prisoner of what these algorithms are recommending them. And could that be also not reflecting how consumers' preferences will shift over time? Are we doing something that may be leading to completely different equilibria here in this space?
Yeah, I do think that there is not, sometimes when you personalize too much, there is not enough exploration, which is happening, right? So my favorite example is Netflix, where when I go to my husband's, account, it's in the same account, but when I go to his persona, it's a completely different set of movies. I'm like, wow, some of these movies I would like to watch, but I never get them, right? So there is an optimal level of exploration as well as personalization. And both in terms of, many of these engines, as we said, we think of consumer behavior as a given, but they might actually be shaping consumer. I think polarization in the political space is a very good example of this, where, if it shapes and changes how you think about things, it's not that you have independent preferences based on what you are fed, right? So, and that can, so we can end up in these consumption bubbles. So I think, it's both a firm's optimization question on what's right for them, but I think it's also a broader, policy question of what information should, consumers be shown, both a consumer welfare question as well as a firm, revenue question. So.
Yeah, this is fascinating. We've explored a lot of range of issues, but I'd like to know a little bit more about Hema, the person. And you're obviously a fantastic researcher.
Thank you.
What are some of the things that you do outside? You did mention cooking before and family time. Are there any things you briefly mentioned about Netflix movies? What are some of your other passions or pastimes?
So because we live in Seattle and there is so much greenery and so many beautiful trails outside, one of the things I like to do, and I've been doing a lot more during this COVID, is going for walks. And with also my daughter is more mobile now, being 5.
I know.
Can actually make her walk.
She needs more outdoors than all of us.
Yeah, so I like going for walks. So that's very nice. Or I just like to drink tea and read some books. Otherwise, I'm not doing very active, crazy things. But
Okay, what are some of the books that you've recently read, or would you recommend?
So I like reading books to the extent I can, and one of my favorite authors is Barbara Pym, and she's she wrote from like 50 to 70s, and mostly about women and their lives, and it's very funny. She's kind of like Jane Austen, but slightly in a different era. So I really like and enjoy her books.
Some of her work.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. So we got to hear the other side of Hema. And, I want to ask you before we conclude the interview, what would your advice be for all the viewers and listeners? Our viewers and listeners are drawn from all different segments. We have former students, current students, executives, policy officials, donors. What would your recommendations or suggestion for them to be preparing themselves better for the future, managers in general?
I think my only suggestion would be it's like a very exciting time for students, firms, and academics and marketing. There are a lot of new exciting development, like we were talking about, optimization, personalization, and automation of many marketing activities. The only thing I would say is that many of these seem often daunting, but my only suggestion would be to not be very shy, whatever your role is, and go learn about and innovate in this
Right.
space. And there's some things will work out, some things won't, but it would still be a fun it would be a great learning experience, and I think that we would all benefit from that.
That's a great message. Just be open to learning new things. And also what I hear from you, Hema, is also be willing to experiment, whether it's you're a student or a constant learner or a firm or a manager. Be willing to experiment and learn new methods, technologies,
Yes.
and innovations. Is that correct?
Yes, that would be the summary.
That's a great message for our audience. Hema, you've spent a lot of very, very important time with us today, and I certainly enjoyed listening to your insights and share your experiences. I hope you enjoyed the interview as well. Thank you very much again for giving us your valuable time.
Thank you so much. It was lovely.